What is Islamic studies? What does Islamic studies do and not do? What is late antiquity? What was the political configuration of the late antique Near East? What was the political and social situation in Arabia specifically? What is Deen, the Hijaz, the Kaaba, and the Quraysh? How does the Quran relate to its original setting? Last time, we discussed the numerous ways we can try to define something as complicated as Islam. For each method we came up with, we were hounded by a shortcoming of that same method. If you assume what is popular defines Islam, then minority opinions of Islam disappear or seem irrelevant. If you define Islam by its common vocabulary, then Islam becomes more Arab-centric than it really is. And so on like that. Well, just as any method we use to define Islam falls short, so does any method we use of studying Islam and Muslims themselves. In this course, we're going to engage in a discipline called Islamic studies. But don't let this name fool you. Islamic studies does not include just any way one may study Islam. There are lots of ways to study Islam formally, and only some of them are Islamic studies. In short, though, Islamic studies means that we will only be discussing Islam as a historical phenomenon which can be measured by the human and material sciences. We will only discuss Islam as much as material, quantifiable data can demonstrate it to anyone, including to a non-Muslim. In this classroom, we will only address Islam insomuch as we can detect it with our 5 senses and historical data. So what does that mean exactly? Islamic studies is studying Islam without making claims about ultimate reality. For instance, the existence and nature of God. But instead, what people called Muslims have historically said about God. We're not going to ask, does God exist? But rather, what does a certain Muslim say about God? Whether God exists or not, and in what way, cannot be addressed by the human and material sciences as we know them. Now, of course, you're welcome to have your own thoughts on the subject. In fact, I insist that you have your own thoughts on the reality or not of the divine. But those have no bearing in this class or in formal Islamic studies. Also, Islamic studies has to be driven by historical information alone. In Islamic studies, we can't make any claim that can't be demonstrated with observable materials like texts and artifacts. So, for example, in Islamic studies, we don't say Islam says X or Muslims think Y, but instead, what does this particular Muslim say Islam is? Or how do we know that these particular Muslims thought Y? You see the difference? In Islamic studies, we aren't making claims about what Islam is for all times and places, but rather, we use evidence to show us what Islam is and can be in particular times and places. And once again, we are welcome to have our opinions about what Islam itself really is. But in this class, we're only going to work with material data that we can all examine and question. And finally, Islamic studies does not make any claims about morality. Whether so-and-so is a good Muslim or not isn't our problem here. This isn't the business of the social and material sciences, which do not comment on what ought to be, just what is and has been. That means if we encounter Islamic phenomena that we love, or Islamic phenomena that we hate, that love or hate is irrelevant. One more time, you are totally encouraged to have ethical opinions about the subjects we're talking about here. I really hope you like Islamic poetry and hate suicide bombers. But that's incidental. Whether we're studying beautiful poetry or horrible violence, in Islamic studies, that is, in this class, we're going to remain morally detached. Of course, there are ways of studying Islam that make claims about the reality and nature of God, or claim to know what Islam itself really is, or what is good or bad according to Islam. These are called ulum ad-din, the traditional forms of how Muslims have studied their own faith that dates back to the early Middle Ages. The traditional Islamic sciences, the ulum ad-din, ask, what is God like? What does God want? What is Islam supposed to be? And how can one be a good Muslim? But we're not taking that route because in this class, we're not all trying to come to the same conclusions about our topics. Now, I'm imagining many of you are Muslims in a variety of ways, and you have a variety of opinions. And many of you are not Muslims, and you have your own opinions about God, Islam, and morality. But by putting aside our personal opinions, that is, by practicing Islamic studies, we can try to find a common ground. Muslim and non-Muslim of any personal background, the Islamic studies approach should, ideally, teach us to examine Islam in a way that works for all of us. Just to show you the difference. Imagine the famous story of the moon being miraculously split in half. According to several sources from the Middle Ages, Muhammad and some of his followers once saw the moon break in two so that half of it was on either side of a certain mountain. Was this a miracle? A vision? Just a legend? If you're practicing the traditional sciences of Islam, the ulum ad-din, you're welcome to wonder about the reality of the story and what it says about God, Islam, and the nature of Muhammad as a prophet, a nabi, and a messenger, a rasul. However, from the point of view of Islamic studies, we can't affirm or deny the existence of miracles or even God. No scientific experiment can prove or disprove a miracle, since a miracle, by definition, is an exception to science. So, we can't ask, did the moon really split in half or not? We will only work with what is scientifically demonstrable. So, we can ask, who reports this story of the moon being split in half, and when? What did the given authors of the different versions of the tale have to say about the supposed incident, and why? What do the historical accounts of the splitting of the moon have to say about the various Muslims who wrote these accounts, about their societies, about their histories, and about their worldviews? Okay, so we're doing Islamic studies in this course, which means that we will only be focusing on things that we can demonstrate using material evidence, science, and textual sources. So that means we're going to have to ground everything we say in this class about Islam in history. Now, there's quite a bit of Islamic history to cover, and so to make it a little bit more manageable, we're going to divide the history of Islam into 4 rough categories. These categories are totally artificial. They're just going to help us refer to large chunks of time quickly. We're going to divide Islam as follows. First, Islam as a historical phenomenon appears in late antiquity, which is roughly the period between 300 and 800 CE. Then, we have the Middle Ages, or the classical Islamic period, between 800 and 1800 CE. After that, we have the modern period, or the colonial period, from about 1800 to 1950 or so, when most of the world's Muslims lived under some European colonial government. And then finally, we have the post-colonial or postmodern, which is our own time, from about 1950 to the present, when most of the European colonies no longer exist. Again, this way of slicing up history is in a certain sense completely arbitrary. We could easily divide Islamic history into other ways, and correctly, but we're just going to use this 4-part scheme to help our minds lock onto what we're talking about a little easier. For now, we're going to focus on the first of these 4 divisions of history, the time period we now call Late Antiquity. Late Antiquity, from the German Spätantike, refers to roughly between 300 and 800 CE, but scholars could and do disagree on those dates for various reasons, so don't take those dates too literally. Late Antiquity as a period is all about the reformation of empires and their worldviews. In Southern Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia, the Roman Empire was still moving along, as it had been for centuries. The Roman Empire was vast, encompassing many different peoples, cultures, and languages. Roughly, though, the Roman world was divided in half. In the west, the lands that now make up Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Morocco, Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, and parts of England, was the Latin Roman world. Not that everyone there spoke Latin, but it was the primary language of Roman government, commerce, and culture. In the eastern half of the Roman Empire, Greek was the major common language of Roman administration and literature. This includes the lands that are now the Balkans, Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Israel-Palestine, and Egypt. As you probably know, the ancient capital of the Roman Empire was in the Italian city of Rome, which was in the Latin West. But slowly, the power, economy, and culture of the Roman Empire started to shift away from the Latin world in the West into the Greek world in the East. First off, the Greek or eastern half of the empire had always been wealthier and more densely populated than the West. In the East, you would find large, already ancient cities like Athens, Alexandria, or Damascus, and they dwarfed places like Paris and London, which at the time were just minor villages. Well, because there was more people and more money in the East, the culture of the East came to dominate the Roman Empire. Most notably, this was in the arrival of Christianity. Christianity was an Eastern cult, appearing and most popular in the eastern half of the Roman Empire, the Greek half. And then, the Romans moved their capital into the east, to the strategically important port town of Byzantium, which was then renamed Constantinople in the 320s. By the way, this is the modern city of Istanbul, Turkey. So in other words, by the early 4th century, the religion, culture, and capital of the Roman Empire had moved entirely to the east, while the western half of the Roman Empire, the Latin half, famously collapsed into smaller political units led by local kings and chieftains. But the Eastern Roman Empire would continue to thrive for centuries to come, not ending until the year 1453. Now, historians today call this incarnation of the Roman Empire between the 320s and 1453 the Byzantine Empire, after Byzantium, the village upon which the new capital of Constantinople was built. But just because we're going to call them the Byzantines, just remember they're really the same old Romans, with emperors and togas and all that, only now Christian and with a capital in the east, not in Rome. And the Roman Byzantines were not the only Christian empire in late antiquity either. In East Africa was the Aksumite Empire, with its capital in the city of Aksum, modern Ethiopia. The Aksumites also became officially Christian in the early 4th century, and for this reason, they were often allied with the Roman Byzantines to their immediate north. The Aksumites ruled over the lands on either side of the Red Sea, modern Ethiopia Eritrea, Somalia, Djibouti, Sudan, and Yemen. The Aksumites controlled most of the trade that moved goods through the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. Their official language was Ge'ez, classical Ethiopic, a Semitic language, like Arabic. The other great empire of late antiquity was the Persians. At this time, the Persian Empire was under the control of the House of Sassan, so the Persians would have also been known as the Sassanids. The Persian Sassanids controlled most of the land that is today Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Gulf states, and the Caucasus. Their empire's capital was in Ctesiphon, the great city on the Tigris River, about 20 miles from the modern city of Baghdad. While the Persian Empire at this time had a huge population of Christians, as well as some Jews, pagans, and Buddhists, they were officially Zoroastrians. Zoroastrianism is the ancient Persian religion of the god Ahura Mazda, a good god of light who spoke through prophets, as the biblical god of the Jews and Christians did. The Persians spoke Pahlavi, or Middle Persian, an Indo-European language that's actually distantly related to Greek, Latin, and even English. So there are our major imperial players in the late antique period. The Byzantines, or Romans, the Aksumites, or Ethiopians, and the Persians, or Sassanids. The vast majority of the people in these three empires were Christian in some form or another, although there were sizable numbers of Jews, Zoroastrians, Buddhists, and pagans around too. They spoke a variety of languages, and collectively, they controlled nearly all the central lands of the Asian landmass for centuries. And as empires neighboring each other always do, they fought over these lands over and over again. In the middle of these three empires was a place that was oddly never firmly under the control of any of them, the peninsula that we call Arabia. Arabia is hot. Very, very hot. It is one of the driest, most arid regions on the planet. The majority of the land is rocky desert, and there are no navigable rivers and just a few useful ports. Rain is scarce over the central mass of the peninsula, and so the only settlements of note surrounded oases, where wells could support livestock and agriculture, as long as the population was relatively low. Not surprisingly then, Central Arabia in late antiquity had no major cities, since the environment just couldn't support them. The extremity of the Central Arabian environment meant that the empires of the day, the Roman Byzantines, the Aksumite Ethiopians, and the Persian Sassanids, didn't hold much direct political sway in the region. Sure, these empires invaded Arabia from time to time, or sent armies through there, but there was little to be gained from holding such an inhospitable region. Wars are expensive, and colonization even more so. So, what was there to be gained by invading a massive desert with very limited resources? And so, Central Arabia remained something of a political vacuum. It was surrounded by empires, but it was rarely a formal part of any of them. And this rather odd situation made Arabia a little bit unusual. Now, in one sense, Arabia was right in the middle of the great empires and cultures of the day. The people of Arabia were in direct contact with all the languages, religions, and goods of their neighbors. But in another sense, Arabia was a bit of a backwater. There was no one stable government, king, empire, church, language, or religion that defined the peninsula. As such, The Arabian lands were rather diverse. Without anyone to force a religion, language, or legal system over everyone, people were much more free to do what they wanted. They spoke more than a dozen languages, including a cluster of dialects that we call Arabic. Some of these people were Christians, some Jews, some Zoroastrians, and some pagans. And because there was no religious institutions backed by an official ruling elite like a government, there was a great variety of different kinds of paganisms, Christianities, and Judaisms too. And again, just as there was nothing like a central government, the ruling order of the Arabians was tribal. A tribe is just another way of saying a large family group, where people are all related to each other by blood or marriage. In theory, if not always in reality, a tribe would be defined by descent from a common ancestor, some ancient person of note. Your duty was to your tribe, your extended family, who supposedly shared this ancestor with you, and your duty was to no one else. The only law, for lack of a better term, was allegiance to your tribe. Something to make note of, though. Many of the categories that we use to explain people today don't really have any analogs in the ancient world, in Arabia or anywhere else. Thoughts like religion, race, or nationality all belong to the modern period, many centuries in the future. First, there was no one notion like nationality. While some ancient empires had some concepts like citizenship, this is nothing at all like what we mean by citizenship today. In the Roman Empire, for example, a citizen was someone who was legally protected by the government as a member of the ruling classes. Most people who lived under the Roman Empire would in no way be considered Roman citizens. In a place like Arabia, where there wasn't any government like that at all, there was no real concept of nationality to even speak of. If you asked someone for Arabia what they were, they would only be able to tell you what tribe they belonged to, their family ancestral group. And neither was there any notion of race. The ethnic group we today call Arabs was completely unknown. So even calling the Arabian peoples Arabs is a little misleading. Now, granted, there were ancient people referred to as Arabs, but this wasn't an ethnic group, but rather a way of life. An Arab referred to someone who was a Bedouin, someone who lived a semi-nomadic life of trade. In other words, an Arab was simply not a town dweller. Now, there was a family of related dialects called Arabic, but the people of ancient Arabia did not, on the whole, refer to themselves as Arabs, or did they even think of themselves as belonging to a single ethnic or racial group? Again, only the tribe defined you and your belonging. And finally, there was no proper notion called religion. When we today say religion, what we mean is the personal belief system that an individual holds about the transcendent, which reflects on how one is to behave. The peoples of late antique Arabia didn't have that either. In fact, no one ancient people anywhere had any thought like that. The closest thought that the late antique Arabians did have was deen. The word deen means repayment or recompense. It's how one repays a debt owed to a god or gods. You do a god a favor, say by making an offering, and hopefully that god will pay you back by blessing you with whatever you want or need. Deen means giving and getting what is owed. Deen is not primarily a belief system as much as it is a way of behaving and a series of cultural practices. And unlike our notion of religion, deen is tribal, not individual. You can't have a personal deen. You can only have the deen of your people. In that sense, deen is much more like the modern English word cult, but not in the pejorative sense of the word. cult in the sense of a series of group practices and activities towards a certain object of praise or worship, like a god, a spirit, or a spiritual leader. And again, if you ask someone in late antique Arabia what their deen was, they would probably just tell you the name of their tribe, since allegiance to a god or gods was tribal, not personal. So all that is to say, tribe was everything. It covered all the things we mean by family, culture, religion, race, ethnicity, and nationality. So, for instance, say a certain Arabian person was a speaker of Arabic, they lived in a tribal community, and practiced some form of Christianity, and you asked them, "What are you?" They would probably just tell you the name of their tribe, and that would tell you all you needed to know about their cultural, ethnic, and religious identity. Another feature of late antique Arabia that made it a bit distinct from its imperial neighbors was the absence of any formal literatures. While there are ancient graffiti tags and inscriptions in the various Arabian languages, there are no known books written in ancient Arabia. Books are expensive, and they take a lot of time to produce, as in the ancient world, the only way to make a book was to copy it out by hand. So, the tribal peoples of Arabia didn't have much access to books. They knew about them. Their imperial neighbors had books. There had been formal literatures in Greek, Pahlavi, Ge'ez, Syriac, Hebrew, Aramaic, Coptic, and a few other Middle Eastern languages for centuries. In the late antique period, we start to see the first official versions of the Bible in these languages. Likewise, commentaries on the Bible, like the Mishnah and the Talmud, philosophy books, medical books, and legal books all existed, but not in Arabic. If you mentioned a book to a late antique Arabian, they would certainly assume that you were discussing written in a foreign language and probably very far away. What the tribes of Arabia did have, though, was spoken lore. Like the vast majority of people who ever lived, the tribes of Arabia spoke their culture in verse, stories, song, oration, and prose, all of which you would have to memorize. To the peoples of Arabia, the most important of these was poetry. And because all history, information, and news was found in this oral form, not in books, the Arabian poet wielded a great deal of social power. They could sing the glories of their tribe, or of their tribe's prowess in battle. In a time and place where public information could only be stored in an oral form, the poets served as their tribal spokesperson, a news reporter, and if that poet was inspired by a god or a spirit, they had a quasi-religious role too. If you were a tribal person in late antique Arabia, and you wanted to learn about faraway lands, the wisdom of Jewish rabbis, the life of Jesus, or the stories of your local gods, you would have to ask the poets. Because the culture of Arabia was governed by tribes, and there was nothing like formal governments, books, or official religions, Arabian culture was, on the whole, quite local. Sure, the people of Arabia were in contact with the larger world of late antiquity, but since no government, church, or ruler was consistently forcing anyone to do anything, the local tribes dictated what people did and thought. So, the culture of each tribe and place could be rather different than the cultures of neighboring tribes just a few miles away. So, let's just zero in on one region of late antique Arabia that is especially important to the rise of Islam, and take a look at its unique culture. The western central region of Arabia was, and still is, known as the Hijaz. These are the lands that run down the rocky western half of the peninsula, marked by lava plains and the occasional oasis. In the late antique period, there were no proper cities in the Hijaz, just a number of towns and villages, each controlled by a tribe or tribes, and the nomadic Bedouin would move between them and their neighboring empires, the Romans, the Ethiopians, and the Persians. Of particular note is the village of Mecca. You've probably heard of it. Mecca was a rather remote place by ancient standards. It's surrounded on all sides by mountains, and it isn't near any notable body of water. It doesn't appear on any ancient map, and it isn't mentioned by any ancient historian. The only noteworthy feature of Mecca would have been its local shrine, its Kaaba. A Kaaba, Arabic for cube, is just that, a cubical structure made of bricks, in which the cult or deen of a local god or gods is found. The Kaaba in Mecca was devoted to several local gods and goddesses, but the place seems to have been visited by Jews and Christians as well. The ruling tribe of the village of Mecca was Quraysh. Indeed, they seem to have been the only tribe of noteworthy presence there at all. The Quraysh were the guardians of Mecca's cube shrine, its Kaaba, and like the shrine they guarded, their cultural practice, their deen, was a mix of several pagan, Jewish, and Christian elements. There does seem to have been some members of the tribe of Quraysh who were officially Jewish or Christian, but chances are most of them did not think in such terms. They would have known about the local Arabian gods and spirits, as well as the stories and poems of Jewish and Christian heroes, saints, and teachers. Neither paganism, Christianity, nor Judaism were foreign to the Quraysh's deen. And it is here, in the Hijaz, in the village of Mecca, amongst the Quraysh, that Muhammad lived. He was one of the Quraysh, a merchant and the member of the sub-clan of the Quraysh called the Banu Hashim. Muhammad presented a series of oral performances which called themselves the recitation, the Quran. Because the Quran appeared amongst these people in that specific setting, in that specific time, it spoke in a way that the Quraysh would understand. First, the Quran was in Arabic, in one of the local dialects of the Hijaz region. And it talks about itself as a Quranan Arabiyan, an Arabic recitation, many times. Remember that Arabic was not a language of formal literature. So when this performance appears, and repeatedly mentions that it is specifically in the Arabic language, it carries the notion that this is a message for a particular people, not the foreign rulers of empires with all their books in Pahlavi, Ge'ez, Greek, and Syriac. This is a recitation in the language of a common people. Second, as the Hijaz was by no means a great center of written literature, the Quran appears as an oral performance, not, at first, as a written text. The Quraysh were already, and since ancient times, familiar with receiving all of their information orally, especially from the poets, and so the Quran followed suit. The Quraysh were a people used to hearing their information and stories, not reading them, and so it follows that the Quran is made to be said, not read. Third, because the Hijaz, like all Central Arabia, didn't have a fixed standing government with official laws or monarchs, the Quran doesn't speak in very legal or governmental terms, for the most part. Instead, because it's addressing itself to a tribal people, the Quran is much more concerned with personal behavior and ethics. It only occasionally gets into matters like inheritance and taxes, but it repeatedly, and at length, dwells on how one human being is to treat another, with a special priority to the poor, the orphans, widows, and various other people in need. And fourth, because the people of Mecca and all Arabia had a notion of deen, of cultic debt to a deity, the Quran speaks this way too. Specifically, the Quran speaks of the deen of the biblical God of the Jews and Christians. How is one to behave and offer thanks to this one specific God, And how will this God reward or punish you, that is, repay you, for what you've done? Now remember, because the Quran is appearing amongst the Quraysh tribe, they were quite familiar with paganism, Judaism, and Christianity. The Quran assumes such. The Quran tells people to follow a deen involving stories, behaviors, moralities, and practices that were known to the Quraysh. Indeed, the Quran counts on this. The Quran insists that the Quraysh remember God, remember the prophets, and make note of and practice the morals they know already. Answer these questions for class in detail and using your own words. What is Islamic studies? What does Islamic studies do and not do? What is late antiquity? What was the political configuration of the late antique Near East? What was the political and social situation in Arabia specifically? What is Deen, the Hijaz, the Kaaba, and the Quraysh? How does the Quran relate to its original setting?